philosophy for many years. So he has quite a lot of experience working in philosophy and theology. And today we're going to hear his lecture about Transcendental Phenomenology and psychedelic science. And so thank you for sharing your knowledge of this topic. It has been many students ask me what are you going to talk about. So they have queries about it. Well, we're going to hear you then.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me back there? Yeah. It's my great pleasure to be here in Mexico. I first came to Mexico 52 years ago. I was a 20-year-old student. I went to the city Cuernavaca to study Spanish at a little school called Seminole, which is still there. And it was, I think, my fate that I studied a lot more in that year, 1974, 1975, than Spanish, because two different lives came together there. On the one hand, there was Demetrio Sodi Morelos, not the journalist, but the theoretical anthropologist, who had been the head of the Indigenous Peoples of the Americas institution in Mexico from 1961 to 1974. So I don't know if it's a coincidence, but the year I came to Mexico was the year he quit that position. As he later told me, he did so because he realized he was not helping the indigenous peoples. He was actually helping them be exterminated by Western civilization. And so he had a house in Cuernavaca, and he went to the school Seminole, and he says, do you need a teacher of Nahuatl? So for a year, I studied Nahuatl and the ritual use of hallucinogens in the religion of Mesoamerica with Demetrio, theoretically. Then one of the husbands, the husband of one of the Spanish teachers, Paco Guerrera, was a field anthropologist. And when he was a boy, he got hit in the head with a baseball, and his mother was indigenous. Modern science couldn't help him. He was blind. So she went back to her village, took him to the curandero. He gave him medicine. He looked into his soul. He found nails in his eyes. He pulled them out, and he could see again. Paco took us to the Quique Indians in Oaxaca, where a curandero looked into my soul's future. He broke an egg. He put it into a glass. He looked at the way that the egg and the water interacted. And he said, I was going to live a long life and be very successful, and one day come back to Mexico and share my knowledge. This is the third time I've been to Mexico since he told me that. The first time was to talk about Nator Crystal in Heidegger. I never even thought or remembered that he told me this. And reflecting on this, I realized this was not the knowledge he said. He saw that I was going to come to share. I came again and talked about Plato. I never remembered what he said to me, but now on this trip I remember, and I think this is what he saw in the future I was going to share with my American friends here. So the very notion of an exact dose of a psychedelic drug, let alone a macro one, is deeply embedded in Western medicine and culture, as is the classification of diverse psychotropic plants and fungi as psychedelic substances. From the transcendental phenomenological standpoint, both the notion of an exact dose and the characterization of what is dosed as a psychedelic substance show that the set and setting of 21st century ingestion of these plants, fungi, and amphibians has become an artifact of Western culture, notwithstanding the non-Western provenances in which such substances were first recorded. The significance of this artifact cannot be overestimated, for it gets to the heart of why psychedelic drugs are so controversial. Ever since Western culture stigmatized such drugs on theoretical and scientific grounds, they were marginalized as morally and medically dangerous. First by the Spanish missionaries, who documented their demonic use among indigenous Americans, and by the Church's largely successful quest to eliminate so-called witches with magic potions. Then by the male physicians who discredited plant-based healing while founding modern medicine as a science. And I'm sure you all know this, but I think it's important. In the late 16th century, Roman Catholic missionaries in North, Central, and South America encountered the indigenous inhabitants ingesting certain plants and fungi for religious purposes. This encounter yielded both the historically first systematic reports of the use of psychotropic plants and their theologically based condemnation. At about the same time, the non-Christian remnant of the pagan use of psychotropic plants and fungi, continued by women healers and witches who had coexisted for centuries with the Christian tradition, was eliminated with the extermination for heresy of these women by representatives of Western Christianity. Western culture's engagement with the non-Western peoples for whom ingesting these plants and fungi was, and often still is, indigenous, is therefore no trivial detail. It is bound up with a culture whose religious and political representatives have, to this day, rejected them. An artifact of the unique Western approach to knowledge that places medicine among the kinds of knowledge of the science of nature. The medical history of psychedelic substances began in the late 17th century. And while much remains controversial, the general outline of the West engagement is not. The genealogy of the dyad set and setting, operationally well established through though controversial in psychedelic science, is instructive for the transcendental phenomenological engagement with that science. Its roots lie in the mid-19th century invention of pharmacology by Rudolf Buchheim and his student Oswald Schimmelberg, an invention driven by scientific positivism, which grounded pharmacology's understanding of scientific knowledge in empirically measurable mechanisms. Quantifiable physiochemical and physiological evidence establishing the effects of drugs independent of psychological and other non-physical variables. Henry Beecher's 1955 article, The Powerful Placebo, challenged this project with evidence of physiochemically inert drugs producing physiological effects in certain psychological contexts, questioning pharmacology's vision that all measurable physiological changes coincident with the ingesting psychochemical compounds are caused by them. Beecher's article and the placebo studies that followed framed Timothy Leary's 1962 paper, How to Change Behavior, which argued that the experimenter's demeanor, the subject's expectations, and the social context of administration of psychotropic substances significantly determine a drug's effectiveness. Leary formulated these as set and setting. And 2 years later, with Ralph Metzger and Richard Alpert, he gave the now canonical formulation. A psychedelic experience is a journey to new realms of consciousness. The scope and content of the experience is a function of set and setting. Set denotes the preparation of the individual, including his personality structure and his mood at the time. Setting is physical, social, and cultural. These experiences are not drug-induced, in the sense of being a direct effect of the drug chemicals, but are of the nature of set and setting. Analyzed closely, it is unclear what set and setting means here. A generalization from empirical research, or a protocol for orchestrating psychedelic experience. The claim that psychedelic experiences are not drug-induced, meaning a direct effect of the chemicals, raises more questions than it answers. The nature of the supposed indirect effects go unmentioned. From a transcendental phenomenological standpoint, which dispenses with all causal explanation, describing what appears in psychedelic experience exclusively as it appears, set and setting each describe the fundamental structural invariance presupposed by any situation of psychedelic ingestion. In the West, that situation may be formally therapeutic, informally so, with what we call in America, I don't know here, trick-sitters, or recreational, self-renewal in the original sense. The ancient Greek therapia, attentive service to restore health to a body or soul, captures this context, encompassing but not reduced to medical healing. Set initially characterizes the patient's self-understanding of their inner life, expectations, and their sense of why they seek psychedelic therapy. Setting initially characterizes the therapeutic encounter's immediate surroundings, the physical, social, cultural, and historical umwelt, including any therapist, sitter, or others present, and where present, their consciousness of the patient's self-understanding and expectations. This account exhibits a multidimensional horizon whose relevance may emerge in the situation's dynamics. On the step side, the horizon is the patient's self-understanding and expectations, educations, previous therapies, life experience, and its history. On the setting side, it is the therapist or sitter's self-understanding, expectations, training, and prior experience in such situations. Both dimensions open onto culture, family, social group, religion, and a culture's artifacts, and culture onto history. Many such artifacts originate in one culture, not initially shared by others. Headphones, curated music playlists, and eye shades are Western, as are heart monitors and IV drips. So too are non-physical artifacts, such as the very concept of an exact dose, or the classification of laboratory-produced drugs as being the same kind of substance as certain plants and fungi. Classifying drugs as substances highlights the impact of cultural artifacts on the psychedelic setting. The notion substance, as we all know, is originally ancient Greek. The word substance translates, in this context, Aristotle's Hypokemenon, that which underlies all changes by remaining the same. As applied to drugs, it designates the physiological properties physiochemically diverse plants, fungi, and drugs share. Knowledge supposedly produced by pharmacology. But pharmacology, as a natural science, deals with the physical chemical properties of drugs. The concept of a psychedelic substance can only mean a drug with the physiochemical property of making the mind present. As we'll see, as you all know, psychedelic is a neologism, it's a made-up word. Yet the mind is neither physiochemical property nor made present via physiological evidence. Both kinds of property are physical, and neither can present evidence of something mental. However profoundly such drugs affect the mind, pharmacology as a physical science cannot in principle provide evidence to that effect. Since mental phenomena cannot appear in sense perception or its instrumental extension, whose objects are necessarily physical. The point here is neither semantic nor metaphysical, but phenomenologically philosophical. Pharmacology studies drugs' properties through physical evidence, directly present in sense perception and its instrumental extension. It does not study the mind, not by choice, but because the mind is not physical and so cannot be perceived, measured, or quantified. Western culture has another science for that, psychology. If the distinction between pharmacology and psychology is cognitively respected, pharmacology cannot produce knowledge about the mind. What then is the scientific basis for the artifact of knowledge in which pharmacology is invoked to classify drugs' effects as not only psychological, but supposedly pathological? The answer must be, for critical phenomenological, or even critical philosophical, or even critical thinkers, none at all. And yet here we are, at the horizon of the psychedelic, and yet here we are at the western horizon of the psychedelic therapeutic situation, whose default illegality of the sine qua non, possession and ingestion of psychedelic substances, is justified by appeal to a science that cannot establish the reason they are outlawed, that they produce pathological psychological effects. This artifact is inseparable from any contemporary Western therapeutic situation employing such substances illegally, and from those in which Western indigenous people and from those in which non-Western indigenous people administer native plants to Westerners, circumventing their illegality at home. I'm sure you all know there's a whole industry where very rich Americans, many from Silicon Valley, come to Mexico to take ibogaine, to do ayahuasca, psilocybin, usually in five-star hotels. Part of the setting. Okay, so this account grounds a deeper engagement with the controversial global status of these substances through Transcendental Phenomenology's critical resources of the constitution of meaning. Here, the constitution both of the meaning of what it is we are talking about and of the meaning of the experience that follows its ingestion. Beginning in 1956, if we are a psychiatrist and a writer, psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, the writer Aldous Huxley, we need a playfully invented word. In a letter in 1956, Huxley proposed an alternative to the psychotomimetic, psychosis mimicking, which was the term then used to describe these drugs. Phanerthine, from phaneros, Greek word visible manifest, and thymos, spirit, offered in a non-famous couplet. So Huxley writes to Osmond this little couplet: to make the trivial world sublime, take half a gram of phanetine. Osmond replied with a coinage built on suke, psyche, which already carried in English usage the very ambiguity of mind and soul he wished to preserve, together with delos, Greek word meaning manifest, clear, visible. And he responded with a couplet: to fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And that's the origin, in every sense, empirical, transcendental, phenomenological, of a term now that is still widely in use to characterize very diverse beings, both man-made and produced by nature. The rest is history, empirically and in the guise of the historicity inseparable from all meaning, transcendentalism. Psychedelic was adopted by both Western science and popular culture, supplanting psychotomimetic and hallucinogen, despite the fact, unknown to Huxley and Osmond, that Mesoamerica's indigenous peoples already had a name for the psychoactive mushrooms science would discover to contain psilocybin. Peonanacocto, flesh of the gods. Reported by Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century and rediscovered by Schultz in the 1930s and the infamous R. Gordon Wasson in 1957. The term has proven resilient even against the 1979 challenge of Ott, Wasson, and Carl Rook, who introduced entheogen, combining the Greek word entheos, full of God, inspired, with genestai, to generate, to mean to generate the divine within. The resilience of psychedelic hinges on two factors: the principle principled secularism of modern Western science, whose practitioners reject, perhaps rightly, appeals to the divine, and their ignorance that there can be no ambiguity in the neologism Greek. For in the Greek, psyche or psyche, uncontroversial means soul, from which nous, mind, is categorically distinct. What the invented word really means is to make the soul manifest. The ambiguity Osmond wished to preserve is therefore not philological, that is the ambiguity between mind and soul, but philosophical, connected to Descartes, who ushered in modernity by declaring that mind and soul, for him, are not distinct but the same. Their sameness designated by the substance of consciousness, understood as the Aristotelian hypokemenon, subject, and not ousia, beingness. All who follow Descartes share this understanding, when no distinction between mind and soul is made, and both are taken to be signified by the word ego. From a transcendental phenomenological standpoint, the controversy over these terms is resolvable. Both the philosophically problematic understanding of psyche as mind and the unhappy infusion of theology and entheogen are resolved once the transcendental reduction is invoked. After the reduction, mind, psyche, the divine, are constituted meanings. As constituted meanings, refer not to real beings with an ontological status independent of the appearance of their meaning, but to what appears to consciousness associated with those meanings, so that the status of what is described is in no way empirical. Nothing, then, stops both terms from aptly characterizing the transcendental phenomenological character of what empirical science calls conscious-altering drugs, in the event that the phenomenological nature of the lived experience following ingestion proves that both the enhancement of the presence proper to the soul, psyche, and the generation of the presence of theos, the divine, are descriptively appropriate characterizations of that experience. So long as these claims appeal to the meaning of words and experience only insofar as they appear to consciousness, nothing empirical, ontological, or metaphysical is at stake at the transcendental level. Such claims nevertheless must factor into that engagement, functioning as the guiding clues necessary for it. That engagement begins with the empirical correlation between ingesting a mind-altering drug and the alteration of consciousness that follows. The transcendental phenomenology of that lived experience is manifestly not empirically accessible. Yet what is reported empirically about it is relevant, because such reports function as theoretically crude first attempts to describe the lived experiences in question. What is invariant to them may serve as the point of departure for a transcendental phenomenological analysis. Clues to guide it, though only initially, since their empirical formulation contains unwarranted presuppositions, obstructing an account of the lived experience's meaning grounded in the things themselves. In this case, it's the thing itself is the altered state of consciousness. And they claim here, in this formal claim, possible to think about any science, you can't get to that topic self through empirical concepts, although those concepts function as the light guide, as a guiding clue that point towards the meanings that are presupposed, but that can be made evidentially present, employing the transcendental phenomenological method. The critique, that is the transcendental phenomenological critique, focuses on the empirical limits of investigating the alteration of consciousness caused by psilocybin and MDMA. And the critique has three foci. The principled incoherence of including changes in brain neurophysiology as a component of the content of psychedelic experience. The unwarranted experiential presupposition guiding the attempt to measure the subjective phenomenology of psychedelic experience through questionnaires whose response is meant to describe etiologically independent common core invariants. Now, this word etiology shows up all over in empirical research of psychedelic drugs or psychedelic substances. And it's rather curious. So they want to claim that independent of how you got to that experience, there's certain common features that all such experiences share. And this is what they focus on, the empirical studies that appeal to phenomenology. It's amazing. You search phenomenology of psychedelics and you get all these empirical studies that talk about phenomenology that has very little to do with phenomenology other than the word, and some vague intuition that, well, we're studying something that we really can't measure directly, so we're going to measure indirectly, or try to measure indirectly. And there's also the presupposition that, and this is crucial, the presupposition that psychedelic experience is intrinsically singular. That is, a self-contained, altered state unconnected to any other. Each singular experience is treated as an isolated empirical data. So regarding the first focus, from the established correlations between psychedelic-induced changes in brain neurophysiology and the onset of altered consciousness, it does not follow that the ensuing subjective experience corresponds to anything empirically established about the brain. Correlation and correspondence are radically different relations. Correlation means two events, taking a drug and the alteration of consciousness, always occur together, one causing the other. And this is all human. Let's go radicalized. And Hume was a smart guy. But it cannot thereby be established empirically that the quality of the experience is a mental effect corresponding to a physical cause, because the evidence would cause claims about brain physiology, machines extending sense perception to perceive the brain's physicality, which is then quantified, and for the psychological experience, and that for psychological experience are radically different. The mechanistic hypothesis that the former directly causes and corresponds to the mind's subjective experiences can never be grounded on psychological evidence, in which nothing could correspond to the evidence at issue in studying the brain. One kind of evidence is physical, the other psychological. The evidence gathered by empirical psychology in service of psychedelic science, our second focus, is guided by a non-empirical psychological supposition that subjective experience in its very being can be empirically accessed through comparisons with what it is like. This lies behind test subject responses to descriptive questionnaires. The subject affirms or denies that their first-person awareness of the psychedelic experience is like written statements about general states of altered consciousness. A high correlation is read as establishing empirically that subjective psychedelic experience is fundamentally structured by the general features described, thus disclosing something able to characterize it as subjectively lived, not merely general markers held the same for anyone who undergoes it. But no test subject is in fact a someone whose mode of being is general. The opposite of general here is not particular in the categorical sense, but what the non-ideologically independent aspects of the subject's personal history manifest, aspects inseparable from their very experience of psychedelic drugs in the first place. The empirical attempt to characterize that experience by what it is like, therefore cannot, in principle, account for the invariable ideology inseparable from it. So empirical science is basically, we don't have to worry about, to get scientific data, we don't have to worry about the genesis of the experience. Whether you're doing psychedelics because you're depressed, because you're bored, because you read Carlos Castaneda, or because your friend did. All this is irrelevant for empirical science to the meaning of the experience. A closer look at the sources of the written descriptions used by two standard questionnaires discloses the phenomenological absurdity of drawing any conclusion about the meaning of subjective psychedelic experience from them. In one case, the source is scholarship articulating the general features of all mystical experiences, features aligning with perennial philosophy. So one of the standard questionnaires is based on some British guy who was originally, I think, a banker, and then did a comparative theoretical study just based on text. He came up with these general descriptions of what he calls the mystical experience. And these are the statements from which this questionnaire is based. So after the experience, you click things. Did you have this, this, or this? And if there's a high correlation, this is empirical evidence, supposedly, about what the experience was like. The other questionnaire, supposedly ideologically independent general characteristics of all altered states, attested by prior research. So here, the altered state could be meditating, could be brain injury, it doesn't necessarily have to be psychedelic induced, but they're claiming the general features, and again, they put these features in the questionnaire after the experience. You say whether or not, and if there's high correlation, they say, well, this is positive empirical data. Both use the same methodology, correlating these statements with the experience test subjects report. High correlations, and one questionnaire is called the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, MEQ for short, are taken as strong evidence that psychedelic experience is like mystical experience. So much so that some studies interpret psychedelic experience itself as evidence for the nature of mystical experience. by correlations on the altered states of consciousness questionnaire, ASC, that it is like non-pharmacologically induced altered states. Because the core significations of each questionnaire overlap, they made grounds of critique, Transcendental Phenomenological critique, of the two claims underlying their use. That what subjective psychedelic experience is like can be determined empirically, and that what it is like discloses its subjective nature. The overlapping statements revolve around the profound unity of all things, dissolving all ego boundaries, accompanied by the ecstatic awareness radiating from it, and by a visionary restructuring associated with sacredness, noetic, that is, immediate insight, or ineffability, paradoxicality, and the transcendence of space and time. The questionnaire thus made three interrelated statements: profound unity, ego dissolution associated with profound unity, and altered and amplified states of the consciousness of ultimate truths. From a transcendental phenomenological standpoint, nothing could be further from the truth than the claim that correlating one's experience with these statements generates evidence that it is like what they describe, and that this being like discloses its nature. Rather than treating the questionnaire statements as descriptions correlating with the subject's report, Transcendental Phenomenology employs them as statements directly describing how such experience appears. The only evidence for whether they capture this how is what is presented in Transcendental Phenomenological reflection on psychedelically altered consciousness. A reflection radically different from the test subjects, whose object includes its relation to general statements about what it may be like. Assessing the adequacy of those descriptions to the how of psychedelic experience is radically different from relating it to general statements that can at best determine whether it is like reports of mystical or other altered states of consciousness. The key cognitive question of psychedelic science is not what psychedelic experience is like, but what it means. What do profound unity, ego dissolution, and the visionary restructuration of the field of consciousness mean transcendentally? The descriptive statements about mysticism and their altered states may be thus redeployed non-relationally as statements about how such experience appears when lived, interpreted. So interpreted, transcendental phenomenological reflection can affirm their general descriptive validity, even as their generality precludes interrogating the transcendental meaning of what they describe. Interrogating the meaning of these statements so interpreted, three questions point toward further research. Transcendental Phenomenology and Psychedelic Science. 1. How precisely does profound unity appear? As a one among other ones, or as a unity all-encompassing, undivided in itself, Not appearing is one in relation to what is not one. 2. How does the ego appear prior to its dissolution? And how does that appearance relate to the Cartesian ego? That is the identification of mind and soul, of consciousness with ego, and of the ego with substance's hypokinesis, or subject. 3. How does the altered consciousness of ultimate truths appear? Do these truths appear through ratiocination? If so, who or what is the ratiocinator, given the ego's dissolution? If not, what is the source of their appearance? And who or what is the consciousness of them following this dissolution? And I should mention in the literature, the other term they use for the dissolving of the ego that occurs in these experiences is ego death. And that's a bit more Heideggerian, not Husserlian, so if you want to use this overloaded Heideggerian, I'm just kidding, but I think dissolution is a phenomenologically more apt description than death, because that's a scary thing. For some. Okay, 2 further questions must be answered. The first concerns the temporality of psychedelic experience. Empirical studies guided by the hypothesis that it yields a positive therapeutic effect on conditions such as chronic depression, trauma, PTSD, assume its singularity. Their medically therapeutic framework precludes investigating whether psychedelic experience has its own proper temporality, unfolding only across multiple sessions, that is, multiple ingestions, and so biases them towards an instant enlightenment. They had some guys that used AI, where you had Trump did an ayahuasca journey, and then after the journey, one thing he's instantly enlightened, and so he has all the Trump mannerisms, talking about how he's going to transform the world and all the things that he loves everybody and all the things that the people often say immediately after these experiences. Instant enlightenment. So the concern remains, even when integration, the concern that about only focusing on the singular experience and not the temporality, that concern remains even when integration therapy is crucial and longitudinal follow-up conducted. Since in both cases, the experience's temporality remains limited to a single instance, precluding investigation of whether multiple experiences in the same subject exhibit a temporal connection in which meaning discernibly unfolds over time. The second question that I want to raise here concerns the ultimate horizon in which psychedelic experience appears. The stark contrast between non-Western reports framing the experiences cosmically, what appears taken as aspects of the world not ordinarily apparent, and the Western predilection to frame it in terms of the soul's interiority, what appears taken as aspects of the soul, likewise not ordinarily apparent. Answers to these questions may now be adumbrated through concrete transcendental phenomenological research into the altered states induced by MDMA and psilocybin. And so here the MDMA is made by man. It was made by actually a German chemist trying to, searching for chemicals that would help stop bleeding. And the research was done during World War I because there was a lot of bleeding going on in Europe. And it didn't work, but it was a new substance, and it was patented by the German company. And it wasn't until some 60 years later that a famous chemist was studying, Alexander Schumling, was studying, doing a catalog of all kinds of psychedelic substances, and I guess there's similarities, so you could invent new ones. And he said, you know, MDMA is very close to a lot of psychedelic things we already know about, and he suggested to psychiatrist friends you might want to try it in therapy. As we know, the rest is sort of history, especially since it was so easy to synthesize. You know, it was just therapists that were using it. You know. Okay, so those are the two that this Transcendental Critique is going to focus on now. And the setting includes test subjects and therapists with terminal degrees in the Transcendental Phenomenology of consciousness, including its historicity, eye shades, and state-of-the-art headphones playing curated musical playlists, and a cultural horizon in which ingestion is illegal. All of this research is being conducted under a trained medical doctor experienced in psychedelic medicine to ensure the safety of the maximal doses necessary to achieve ego dissolution. So, Adam rating now the answers to the phenomenological how of the experience, using as point of departure empirical general statements, with, however, as guiding clues to uncover the intrinsic nature of lived experience, which is anything but general, because I think we will all agree. So, regarding the appearance of profound unity, what appears does so incomparably. The one that appears is not a one among other ones. The unity of anything else that appears does so in association with the incomparable one, the unifying source of all. The first item that appears as other than the being one of profound unity is the ego, not as selfhood or personal identity, nor is the Cartesian identity of mind and soul with the ego as underlying substance, but as the awareness at the center of the field of consciousness. So if you go in there with Cartesian notion of ego and start talking about ego dissolution, you're just telling stories that only make sense to someone who was born after Descartes famously said there's no difference between mind and soul, and that consciousness is actually a subject that underlies all change. And the claim here is that's not what's going on in phenomenology, the way the how of the ego appears, either in non-altered states or in altered states. Okay, so it appears as the ego appears as awareness at the center of the field of consciousness, whose periphery and whose horizon includes the kinesthetic appearance of lived embodiment. With the ego's dissolution, the center becomes dissociated from the kinesthesia and from all previous, that is the bodily kinesthesia, and from all previously peripheral contents which flood consciousness. Okay, so the ego collapses, and then what was on the horizon now floods consciousness. And the claim here is not empirical, nothing's causing anything. This is what happens when you reflect on psychedelic experience without empirical presuppositions. And if it's flooding of consciousness, what was previously out of the periphery, and you can talk about it in psychoanalytic terms if you want. The unconscious now is made present to consciousness without any boundaries. And the ego there's no ego there to control and this experience is the basis of the anxiety that is often reported accompanying ego dissolution. Consciousness, now devoid of the ego center, appears subsumed under the profound unity, which appears as the source of both the non-egoic consciousness and the unification of all that appears. The flooding of the periphery yields the visionary restructuration of what appears, presenting as the boundaryless unity of seeing and seeing. No boundaries, so what is seeing and what is seeing and what is being seen, there's no longer any separation. There's a distinction, but they're unified in this state. The profound unity of egoless consciousness with the all. So the question of who or what is conscious here, given the ego's dissolution and dissociation from the lived body, and of the source of the altered and amplified insight into ultimate truths inseparable from this state, is unanswerable strictly in terms of the altered state. Nor can what these truths mean be answered when their appearance is limited to this state. The meaning inseparable from what is experienced here emerges only in comparison with the non-altered states that precede and follow. The incomparable appearance of profound unity thus presents a datum whose intrinsic meaning can only be witnessed according to what itself appears in the altered state. Any meaning it has for the surrounding non-altered states can be established only by the lived experience encompassing and comparing them. The sole condition for this is the transcendental phenomenological investigation of the datum, or data, when the temporality of the meaning in question is tracked, compared with the non-altered states of consciousness composing the horizons of its appearance. Because empirical psychedelic science is limited here, fully engaging with the appearance of meaning following ingestion requires the following. 1. The Cartesian formulation of the ego as a subject, composed of the unity of mind and soul identical with consciousness. The formulation behind the indistinguishable concepts of ego or self, coincidence with the ego's intuitive meaning in empirical psychedelic science, must be rejected in favor of the transcendental phenomenological movement, the center of the field of consciousness, inseparable from its association with the lived body. 2. The scientific determination of the lived experience that follows ingestion must not be limited to the term psychedelic, whose meaning must be disambiguated from any reference to mind. Thus, soul manifesting is the expansion. The expansion of consciousness to include the boundaries peripheral to its ego center. The lived experience must also be denominated entheogen, manifesting the divine within, since after ego dissolution, the visionary destruction of consciousness cannot have its source in the agency of ego-centered consciousness or in manifestations proper to the soul. In the former case, the ego's dissolution precludes its agency while in that state. In the latter, the interiority intrinsic to the soul rules it out as a source of the meaning, here divine, that radically appears as something other than that interiority. Given the appropriateness of these two denominations, the dual nature of the effects of ingestion must be recognized methodologically. And we want to stress here that what is denominated here are not properties of the ingested drug, but the meaning of consciousness and what appears to it following ingestion. The meaning appears as non-relationally dual, notwithstanding the profound sense of unity inseparable from the being one of all that appears. That is, within the profound sense of unity, there are two discernible, non-independent parts, each unable to appear without the other, both encompassed by the appearing one, profound unity. Fourth, the singular, temporally self-enclosed datum of the altered state, which governs the research paradigm of most empirical psychedelic science, must be replaced by a new paradigm comparing multiple data of altered states to investigate the transcendental phenomenological meaning proper to the temporality linking the multiple states of altered consciousness. Five, the transcendental phenomenological condition of possibility for the new proposed paradigm must be investigated. Specifically, the transcendental awareness that necessarily encompasses both the consciousness of non-relational meaning intrinsic to the altered states of consciousness and their relation to the temporality of the non-altered states of consciousness that necessarily compose their horizon. If the preceding discussion has any cognitive value, it lies in presenting the Prolegomenon to a future psychedelic science grounded in transcendental phenomenology. The paradigm shift called for here shifts the Western understanding of the lived experience of initiation from that which transpires in the mysteries of the altered and amplified states of consciousness, of ultimate truths appearing after ingestion, to include the initiate's lived experience of their perfect embodiment and the natural attitude. The shift also brings into transcendental alignment the Western predilection, which is really a prejudice, to visit the mysteries in the inner world of the mind, not soul, and the reports of their cosmological encounter in and from what was originally a non-Western world. Thank you.
Thank you very much once again for your help. And we open the floor to our audience for comments and questions. Okay, please. Okay, you want to use the microphone? Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Hopkins, for your very interesting and provocative talk about the possibilities of phenomenology to treat this topic. Even if one could think that phenomenology came late to this question, we must remain that Husserl himself was a psychedelic drug user because he loved the tobacco, who is a visionary drug for the Mesoamerican people. So it's a very interesting thing that even in the time Husserl was very interested. For example, the sampling use of the substances, the substance of samples. But, well, my question is, I will try to not give very much book, I don't know. I wrote my question: could transcendental phenomenology give us transcendental phenomenology, like a Husserlian phenomenology, give us a different attempt to the liminal phenomena lived in the psychedelic experience, or we need to reach a gnostic and subjective phenomenology? I was thinking this because, as you say in your conference, the sense of unity, the ego dissolution, and the very profound altered temporality of the absolute inner time stream of consciousness could be seen as the minimal frame to every experience that we could live in our natural attitude or in a normal experience or in an optimal frame of experience. So if the ego dissolution, the sense of unity, and the absolute, timeless, or I don't know how to characterize it,
That's good.
it is so strong. It moves our basis, the basis of the construction of our reality so strong. How could we do descriptions about it when it has a sense of ineffability, a sense of transcendence, a sense of excellence of our experience? And could that be a limit to the description in a transcendental Husserlian phenomenology, or not? How could we do that? And other question is, how could we access to the very experience, to the very psychedelic experience, without taking a psychedelic drug? And it is not a problem that only the people who have lived the ego dissolution could give proof to that as a very original and legitimate experience, or not? I don't know if it has
Another excellent question.
but that is the question. Thank you very much.
So the first question, as I understand it, is given a phenomenological method's foundational commitment to cognition-based and non-empirical description, and this would apply to any experience, not just psychedelic experience of hitting a home run, experience of kicking a ball in soccer, any experience. Given the limits, the natural limits of language, which presuppose, I mean, you formulate this with think. Think makes it easy to talk about, even if it's, language, natural language is the fundamental units of meaning of natural language are onto, right? They presuppose entities in relation with one another. How then can we use the language of these limits to describe experiences that are, whose center meaning as they appear is beyond? They appear as beyond. That way, they appear in such a way that way, when you reflect on it, appears as inadequate to characterize these experiences. So, I mean, this is a perennial question that every Husserlian, every phenomenologist has to struggle with. I would say, one, that's why Transcendental Phenomenology is such hard work. I would say, two, though, your very posing of the question presupposes a mode of access to the limits of language in the face of an experience that you're appealing to that language can't articulate. So already you have a mode of awareness, right, of the of the limits of logos, of the limits of speech or language to characterize. And that then becomes the focus, I would say, for any transcendental phenomenology, especially one, and here, of course, it becomes very acute, because we're talking about an expansion of consciousness, an altered state of consciousness, a non-ordinary state. But I would say, you know, if my paper makes any sense, I'm showing you can do this in a fashion. The second question, I think, is really to the heart of the matter, namely, as I understand it, are we talking about states of awareness, states of consciousness, whose transcendental phenomenological condition of possibility is the ingestion of some kind of substance by the body, that following that ingestion, you have this experience. And I would formulate that to say, and you're, I think, in that question, challenging the same paradigm I am, is the paradigm for the efficacy or utility of, let's just use the term psychedelic as everyone uses, psychedelic substances. You take it, you have the experience, and then you integrate that experience into your life without taking the drug. Right? So you have the big experience, and then if you're a phenomenologist, it's self-reflection. If you're in a therapeutic context, the help of a therapist, they help you in the. And I would say, if we understand the temporality to be singular, then the answer is, well, you have the enlightenment, but the key is to, without any substance, integrate the insight from the experience. My experience is that the temporality is such that the function of the ingestion and the meaning, the deep meaning of the psychedelic experience is to transform the human being. As you know, there's all kinds of speculations, the so-called stoned ape theory, right? When human beings started making pictures, doing things, what are the first things they make pictures of? Mushrooms, everywhere in the world. So much so, anthropologists and people, they say mushroom stones, but it wasn't until very late that a connection was made, a possibility that actually what they were seeing was an animal consciousness in an altered state for the first time, having some minimal level of reflexivity, consciousness as we would understand it. And I think actually that's the whole key to this, and so the temporality is crucial, because in this register, this transcendental phenomenological register, what is crucial is not the duality of body, soul, but animal, spirit. And what psychedelics, and I think the best term for that is medicine, with a capital M, pharmacology, medicine. They are the medicine for the hominoid animals that allow them to transform themselves, spiritualize. And it's a dynamic that we don't agree on. This is what I think the enduring message. I mean, the one thing I love really about the Native American accounts, if you go back before, because the first accounts were recorded by the Jesuits, these were educated people. You didn't have anthropology and all these protocols, but they took seriously what they were saying, only that to condemn them, but they took seriously the first reports. And the reports are, these things are not only cosmological, that is, they disclose the world. another world that's completely related to this world because it's the basis of everything in this world. It's the basis of the social, the religious, the political. That being the case, a crucial dimension of the experience is being taught. That is, the non-Western researching points of view, the flesh is the gods. And the flesh is the gods, we use the Cartesian agency, which helps us talk about it without writing big long books. There's something transcendent appears following the ingestion of these things. And it's talking to us, it's teaching us. And that you don't get in the Western paradigm. And what are we being taught? We're being taught how to transform our narrative. We're being taught how to transform our animal nature in a spiritual direction. Or we're being taught how to spiritualize our animal nature. And I hope that addresses your question about, yeah. And then the next question is, well, is it helpful then to, what is the role of continued ingestion? And here in the West, we have the notion of microdosing, right? So there's the idea that when you have the experience of macrodose, whatever, and then you come down and then you integrate, there's the idea to take smaller amounts after the experience because what should we say? Your horizon of your experience, your consciousness has been expanded, and it can continue then, not just the process of integration, like taking insight from it and changing how I do this or that, but in the process of transformation. Thank you very much.
Just a little remark. Some paleoanthropologists said that this experience with psychedelic substances are not living, or were not a living for language. They might be the origin of language.
Yeah.
Yes, true. Okay, please,
Thank you. I speak up.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. It is very original and interesting. I want to make a sort of two related questions. The first one would be if your research on psychedelics has changed your understanding of the ego, consciousness, and world relationship in Transcendental Phenomenology, because maybe this will be a little bit polemic, but I tend to believe that in the late writings of Husserl, like Cartesian Meditations, the Rites, and so on, he sort of stresses that subjectivity should be divided into ego and consciousness, and towards the other term. So the correlation is triple: ego, consciousness, world, and it seems to me that it could be made the case that consciousness and not the ego is the true absolute.
I would say absolutely. I would say, well, this gets into controversial things, but I think we know that Husserl was, in a sense, Cartesian insofar as he understood the ego as subject, Hypokemenon. And that, I say, that view is, I would argue, is a 16th, 17th century view of the ego that replaced a much phenomenologically and, of course, psychedelically richer understanding of consciousness. And then, it's fascinating to see in the empirical studies when they talk about the ego, it's a mess. They say, well, the intuitive sense of I, self, or something like this. All of this is in the economy of meaning of Cartesian, where consciousness, ego, mind, soul, or all of this some kind of unity and supposedly underlying all experience. And I think if you have a critical sensibility to that, if that is part of your set when you have the psychedelic experience, you realize that that cannot be foundational for the experience. There's a higher state or other state, a more encompassing state of consciousness.
And that brings me to the second question. That's very interesting because how would you see the relationship between the psychedelic science grounded in phenomenology and transcendental phenomenology itself? Because it would seem to me that, all lived experience, including the ones had in psychedelic states, can be the basis for eidetic variations and discovering new essential traits of phenomena, in this case, consciousness and its relationship to the ego. And I was curious as to how would you see the relationship of the sort of experiences that an ego or a subject or consciousness can have in this other state of mind, and if these experiences can be used also in a regular, normal state of mind as part of the material, so to speak, to make eidetic variations. Because in the case of the ego, I think it's interesting because that's something that somebody in an outer state of mind can experience very directly. But then you could also argue in the same case without appealing to the outer state of mind or to.
No, that's a great question. It's one of the tragedies that the early guys that discovered and made public spectacle of psychedelics weren't trained phenomenologists. They were all empirical psychologists. Empirical psychologists in the 50s and 60s, where that meant they're trying to be real scientists. So they're wearing white coats. They have experiments where they have a room where there's a glass where they can see the people in there, but the people can't see them. And of course, this is what blew their mind when they actually did these substances, and they realized that all this stuff can't get to the core of what's going on there. Ralph Metzger, one of the guys associates of Leary, talks about hustle and intentionality. There's some guy, Lundberg, a Swedish guy who was actually an interesting guy. He was a rock critic. He also studied anthropology. He wrote this book on psychedelia, and he makes the same claim that it's Husserl's phenomenology is the ideal, or the best resource for characterizing these states of awareness. And again, that's part of the set. So if you're doing this and you know phenomenology, you know all these structures, that's going to influence the way the experience occurs. If you're someone who joined the army, lied about your age, joined the army, was sent somewhere, and you come back with post-traumatic stress syndrome, and you do these things, you're not going to have all those resources, but still, in therapeutic context, these things restructure basic things that phenomenologists could then articulate the eidetic structure of what's going on.
What I also wanted to suggest is that in some cases, someone in this particular state, psychedelic state, or I don't know what to call it, might see something very clearly, like this distinction between ego and consciousness and the possibility of conceiving a consciousness without ego.
Yeah,
but then he can identify the essential structure of that and use the psychedelic experience sort of a leading clue.
This is what I'm proposing. Yeah. That's my point. To the Prolegomenon to refashioning psychedelic science in terms of transcendental phenomenology.
Okay, thank you. Okay, someone else after.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Professor Hopkins, for this enticing lecture. It's really eye-opening. Well, I would like to ask, first of all, when we talk about the dissolution of the ego, can we talk about also the dissolution of intersubjectivity? For example, when
subjectivity?
Intersubjectivity. When we talk, when Husserl describes in Ideas 2 that the Santonin makes this paper appear with a yellowish haze, we can also think that, yes, while Santonin might give this yellowish color, it also allows us to know that we are having a specific change of the normal experience that we usually have with a paper. But when we see, for example, with people that are on Salvia Divinorum, there isn't this change when they can see specifically these moments, and they are quoting, just scripting, but the experience that the testimony gives are always well, not really absurd, but they are so high that we could also, I mean, I remember when I read one that talks about how he felt in that moment that his own body has disappeared. So my first question would be that, and the other, when you were talking about the ultimate horizon of the psychedelic experience, you talked about a distinction between the cosmical aspect of the trip and the interiority of the soul. Can we think that this change between these two moments is one about about also intersubjectivity, or can we also move it to the distinction that you use between set and setting? Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was a very clear question. It's easy to answer, yes. The subjectivity understood as a hypothemenon, understood as an underlying substance, is only going to is a boundary that has to be transformed, it has to be overcome, and it occurs naturally if you have the proper dose and the proper setting. Okay, the interesting thing is ego is one, body is one, but there's some consciousness there. There's a consciousness there where origin and arche and telos are fluid. So you go one way to experience, you go back to origin. You go beyond coming out of your mother's womb. You go to origin. Everything becomes at a certain level collective. You go back to you're somehow in the unfolding. If you just follow the non-ecological, the non-subjective, you encounter phenomena such as collective procreation. Right? The hominid state, and evolution talks about this, but only in a different, from a hypothetical standpoint. Right? There was a time, and we just saw this in all the beautiful things in the Tequila. Okay, there's a time before we had hominoids. We were no longer monkeys, we were hominoids, and babies are being born, but there's no causal awareness of the role of the phallus in procreation. And so in the state of awareness is the woman, is the feminine, the source of all life. And this all presupposes dissolution of ego, of the idea that the essence of the human is to be an individual. Here the individual emerges out of the collective. And so yes, subjectivity is gone. And even though I said yes, what was, remind me the second?
The second question was about when the first one was about intersubjectivity, and the other was about the distinction between cosmically and the soul interiority. Can we think that this distinction is also a part of set and settings, or also about intersubjectivity? In other words, how can an aspect, an hour from time ago, have this trip when the aspect of the world is a part of his own experience, and for example, a junkie will have a trip that goes about the interiority of his soul or of his own experience. So that's
so I would say that we could say that when I was living among the Trique indigenous people in Oaxaca, doing the field work with Paco Guerrero, he taught us this crucial anthropological distinction. That is, in those days they were called Indians. So the Indians that were sin razón didn't have reason, and it wasn't a negative judgment. It was the Western cosmological context makes no sense to them. And I would say this is not a deficiency, and I would say actually the psychedelic experience, when the ego and subjectivity dissolves, those accounts of the experience are much more relevant than the account that this is something going on in my mind and I'm creating a narrative or something like this. See that I've done before you have ego awareness, it's not like going into another world. You experience another world that is there all the time, but it's only made present when you take the medicine, when you ingest the flesh of the gods. And in this state, then, that the experience, the gods are teaching. Right? If your framework is still subjectivity and the mind, and this is experience in the mind, well, I had a strange experience. Something appeared and said this. Well, I wonder what that means or whatever. That's radically different than saying that the God was manifest and the God told me. The God told me that, and usually telling the curandero that somebody else from another village wants somebody's wife and is doing things to try and poison the family or something. So yeah, that's why I said yes, because the subject is a big obstacle to experiencing the full range of what is occurring in the evolutive state.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Hopkins, for your talk. I also have two questions. So, I'm beginning research on seeking for opportunities and risks in the realms of technoscience, how I understand that, and the decolonial project through the use of enchanted techniques. And I use Bachelard, which is imagination of matter series about the elements and so on. And in this conflict between the techno-scientific and the decolonial, you mentioned tech bros coming to Mexico to take the ayahuasca experience in a 5-star hotel. So that I, in the beginning, see as a risk because it implies an extractive dynamic. But me as a Latin American, I relate to those experiences as a possibility to decolonization and enhancement of an antique culture I belong to. So I wanted to ask you, you related to, I understand you're related to France right now, so there's also a history of psychedelic plants in Europe, mandrake, nightshade, and so on. It seems to me that these have been kind of discarded.
Yeah, the church, and here the Catholics and Protestants united to exterminate any woman who, through their tradition, had a knowledge of medical plants. And it's horrible. And I mean, you read the stories, it was completely, almost completely rooted out.
Yes, so it reveals a political agenda, a racist and sexist agenda hidden in science, and the illegalization of the plants is against women and against non-Western.
It's against nature. Who gives the laws of man, I think man is appropriate here, the right to say citizens, people that live in the nation can't ingest certain plants?
Yeah. So, do you see any further risks and opportunities beyond those I just mentioned, or those you have addressed in your lecture? And second question quickly is, you refer to this as a prolegomenon. Do you intend to go further into this research line, and is there anything you can tell us about it? If so, that you haven't addressed already. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the very friendly question. Not that the other ones were this. No, I gave some hints. This is unfolding. So basically, an accident in my biography when I came to Mexico 52 years ago to study Spanish, these unique events where the Mexican Morales was teaching at this language school, and then we had this field anthropologist. So I had some first-hand experience in these matters. And it was interesting is they told me stop until I know something. And so it's not until like 50 years later I retired, and under the supervision of actually my family physician, was reintroduced. And of course now the setting is totally changed, and so now I've said all I need to say about Husserl, about Plato, about Heidegger, and I'm going to do what our teachers always said, phenomenology is a method that you take to other disciplines to clarify their underlying presuppositions in the interest of meaning and intelligibility. And of course, what the things you refer to with the tech bros and all this is the dark side. But there's always a dark side to psychedelics. Even in the indigenous settings, there's the white and the dark. And then what I learned from the CK, I went there and my Spanish, I guess, was good enough that I could talk to people in the village, and I would ask the boys in their teens or 20s. I was trying to find out, are they still doing these hallucinogens, we call them hallucinogens, then are they still a part of your life? And on the one hand, yes, because the social, political, and religious structure, there's no boundaries or separations in the tricky village where the majority of the people are Sinalason. And the boy, I remember a conversation with this one young man. He says, we don't do that anymore because we know whether we take these things and pray to the gods, it rains or it doesn't rain. And when I asked the women too, they wanted to know, is it true there's machines that wash dishes? So that they don't have to. Within that context, though, what I learned was there was a head curandero, and then each extended family had their own curandero. And this was like not something apart from it, like this is something that structured their very life. If someone was sick, it wasn't because there's something dirty in the water or something, it's because somebody else is doing black magic, as it were, to make them. So this idea that, Timothy Leary, Alan Watts, and all these early guys said, okay, all we need to do is give the world leaders these drugs, they take them, and then it's going to be peace everlasting. To me, that this is the point that what's really going on here is not somehow overcoming mind-body dualism or something like that, but what's really going on is these things have the resource to spiritualize our animal nature. And of course, the tech bros with their transhumanism, these guys want to live forever. They have so much money, and they think that entitles them somehow to be exempt from their animal origins. And I mean, Musk obviously never did MDMA. His drug of choice is basically ketamine, which is actually an anesthesia. And you know, one of Musk's mantras is empathy is what wounds the world, right? He's cynical. He's against empathy. And yeah, so it's a real problem. And I'm discovering this, and like all real problems, I can see no simple solution.
Okay, if you have two more questions, one to back Antonio, and then please.
Thank you, Burt. My problem is with the dissolution of the ego. And perhaps if my question is already answered, sorry, because I'm not sure if I got every word that you said. But first question is, from a Husserlian point of view, the dissolution of the ego would mean the dissolution of experience at all. So, or it remains experience that later the ego can appropriate it. So, my first question is, if the dissolution of the ego is well described, if this is the right concept to talk about that experience that happens there, which I don't know, I have not had this experience. If this is correct, in Husserlian, according to the Husserlian concept, if this is the real dissolution of the ego. And if it is, there must be at least a way that after the experience, the ego can appropriate that experience that it had where he was absent. And there is something like that in those.
So that's a good question. As we know, the ego we're talking about in Husserl, we have the empirical ego, the transcendental ego, and it's a big issue whether these are two different egos or the same phenomenon encountered in different attitudes. So my point of departure is Husserlian understanding of ego, but I believe we have to get rid of the notion of subject. The ego is something underlying all experience, because that's a Cartesian notion that the very constitution of that meaning is limited, has a limited historicity to modernity. So, if we understand the ego not as an underlying subject, but as the center of awareness, okay? But that doesn't mean, the center of awareness doesn't mean it's the hyperhuman. It doesn't mean it's the condition of possibilities for that awareness. So, precisely what happens with the dissolution of ego is dissolution of the center, whereby everything that is on the periphery now floods consciousness. And yes, if the condition of possibility, the transcendental phenomenological condition of possibility for any unity of experience was ego as people's humanism, then you're right, there would be nothing to talk about because there's nobody there. But this I would challenge. I would say this is a bias of Husserl. This is something uncritical relation to Cartesian understanding of ego. I mean, ego itself, at least in English, is interesting, because before Descartes, it was linguistic. We just the eyes. It wasn't any metaphysical substance. It wasn't anything underlying anything. And in English, ego appears because of the translators of Freud into English translated ich with a Latin word ego instead of I. So it sounds like, this. So I would say this is a possibility of ego from transcendental phenomenological standpoint that including now historicity of the meaning of ego, we have to recognize that ego as a subject is something that is historically dated. And yes, all kinds of things follow from that, but certain possibilities for experience are also excluded by that. And then I would suggest after a couple of mezcals, we do some chiquitos, and then we see. We do transcendental phenomenological experience. We see how we deal with the notion of ego as something.
To go through the things themselves.
Yes.
Okay, this was Monica. She wanted to ask.
Thank you, Professor Hopkins. We know for future phenomenology, the word is not present simple as something given. Rather, it acquires meaning through process of constitution carried out by consciousness. What happens if psychedelics modify this constitutive process? This is my first question. And during a psychedelic experience, do we continue inhabiliting the same word of meaning even if it appears strange, or do we temporarily gain access to another possible organization of experience and meaning?
Great question. My answer would be, in the lived experience following the ingestion of the psychedelic medicine, the world no longer in the natural attitude, no longer appears as exclusive unity. There's another world. There's the world of the expanded state of consciousness. And this is not a dualism in the sense that, for me, the whole transformative dunamis power of the psychedelic medicine is that allows you, in principle, to pursue what Plato in his late dialogues called the paradigm, namely an essential meaning structure that appears in discrete instances. So, for instance, in the famous passage in the Statesman where the stranger talks about, introduces paradigm. They're trying to find the eidos of the statesman by doing the division of forms. And they're using as their paradigm shepherd. Right, so the statesman is like a shepherd. And then at a certain point they realize they've chosen the wrong paradigm. There is no essential meaning of being a shepherd that also manifests itself in being a statesman. So then they say we need another paradigm, and that paradigm then is weaving. And the paradigm is weaving. So it's the same essential meaning that the weaver bringing together opposite things to create a harmony and make something stronger that you find in the political knowledge. And I see that as crucial for understanding the relation of the psychedelic experience to the non-psychedelic. And make it even more, the temporal relation of the experience and then what follows that experience. Integration, for me, presupposes we're searching for the paradigms, the things that an experience that also govern what goes on when we're not in the presence of the divine, when our soul is not manifest. So manifest is following the suggestion of medicine.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Burt. This is more or less a follow-up of Antonio's question, because honestly, I don't think that Husserl himself understood ego as like Hopkins. I think it's totally, even if he uses the expression subtract, or how to say this in German, no, so the ego as a, well, the topic appears indeed in the Cartesian meditations, and it sounds like he refers to this notion of Prolegomenon, and explicitly as if it is the case that the ego is a condition of possibility of the experience. But I think this is not the case in Husserl. Actually, in the first edition of the Logical Investigation, he refuses the idea of the centrality of an ego or of the ich in order to give account of the consciousness. Was after Nator, like, made him seeing how important it is to at least consider this idea of ego as an ego pole in order to give account to the transcendental phenomenology and so on. So I don't think Husserl thinks that ego is in any respect the condition of possibility of the experience. It's a moment that makes possible to refer the context of the experience to someone in a very wide way, not a specific way. Actually, this difference between like pure ego and this more personal ego, which is the result of a process of constitution, and I think you are referring to this notion of ego. I mean, the ego already constituted as a person with beliefs and history, but not, it's not the pure ego. Otherwise, when the gods speak, to whom they speak? When you said your words, you said the gods told to me, but nobody's there. So what you can say, well, nobody in the sense of a personal ego, which is like what is dissolved by the experience, psychological experience, but at least there is like someone in a wide way, like a self. Otherwise, there is not this, how do you say, the instance of manifestation of what is given to whom? So even Sartre, for instance, who refuses the notion of ego, the centrality of ego, and he says that, oh no, ego is more, it's a transcendence. But yes, in mere nothingness, he realizes that he needs this dimension, and he says, well, there is society, there is self, it's not an ego. And actually, the difference he wanted to make account is more similar to what we find, for instance, in Ideas 2 in Husserl, when he distinguishes between this personal dimension of ego, which is a result of a process of constitution. This is more related, I think, to what Sartre refers to the ego as the result of well, in the Husserlian terms, result of a process of constitution, a transcendence, something that is given and not something that is already there or attached necessarily to consciousness. So, well, this is the follow-up. I also, once I already mentioned it, Sartre, I want to know what you think about Sartre's investigations, because Sartre perhaps was one of your antecessors in this research of psychedelic use in order psychedelic science, because in the end of the theory, in the late theory, Sartre started an experiment with a medical doctor with mescaline.
And then he wrote the nausea because he had a bad trip.
Yes, exactly.
And he was like tripping for months.
Exactly.
And the only way he came out of it was writing. Maybe he never came out of it, but.
So, however, when I want to see what
this is an excellent question, and really, like all Ignacio's questions to answer, we need a seminar to go back to the text. But I can just say this, as you know, the ego also is a moving target, because logical investigations, he rejects the notion of pure ego. Then he says, oh, I found it, right? But the pure ego then is empty of any content.
Exactly.
If that's not a human, and I don't know what it is, it's something that underlies or presupposes all experience is this pure ego with no content. But even that's a philosophical thing because, as you mentioned in Cartesian educations, we have a distinction between empirical ego, transcendental ego, and now your empirical ego has a dynamic genetic dimension that's articulated for the first time because it's the result of the historicity of habitual constitution. And of course, what we're talking about in transcendental phenomenology are the conditions and possibilities for this constitution.
Yes, but there are experiences that don't require the activity of ego, like for instance, the constitution of life consciousness. There is no ego there.
That's precisely the point. When the ego dissolves, you're in this realm of experiences that don't presuppose it for its constitution.
There is no.
And then you pointed to the big mystery there. It's my eye, and crucial for my articulation of these issues is the connection between ego and the kinesthesia of the living body. That's dissolving. That's the body, that's the really scary thing for a lot of people when it happens the first time, because most of our egos are attached to our bodies, and if that connection is lost, it can create anxiety. Am I going to come back to my body? So yeah, I would say that these are all very rich and pointed issues. But I think that you're very claim that some experience we don't need ego. That's precisely what's being pursued. And the conceptuality for that.
Okay.
And really, my target in this is the empirical notions, is this vague notion of ego self that you can do nothing with philosophically other than critique.
Okay, someone else who wants to?
If there's nobody else, it's sort of a follow, only it's sort of technical. Because I do think that for Husserl in the Cartesian meditations and the crisis that lead, there is in a sense, the transcendental ego is also constituted. It's not necessarily only the empirical ego that is constituted, because also the transcendental, ultimately sense-giving ego has actuality. And thus he says that the correlation is ego, cogito, cogitata, and that both the cogitata, the world, and the ego are constituted. And the ego, the description of the constitution of the ego is genetic phenomenology. Okay. So I don't want to stretch a lot the point, because I don't think Husserl is so extreme as Burt in this point. I agree with Burt's point that there could be a consciousness can be thought of and experienced without the structural center and the connection to a kinesthetic body and so on. But that's not Husserl's point. I think it's
no, I'm not saying this is. Yeah. No, I'm not doing the thing that a lot of people like Mohanty and old Mohanty friends would say, oh, well, Husserl's everything he's thinking about, we Indians, we do this centuries. You hit the key question, because maybe you missed it, but he said Husserl did hallucinogens because tobacco and caffeine. But see, as we learn in Transcendental Phenomenological Psychedelic Science, the dosage is crucial. And you really can't get with caffeine or the tobacco he was smoking. It was Cuban cigars, actually.
Yes.
Some Mexican.
And Dowler used to buy it. Anyway, he needs no Husserl would admit he didn't, because Husserl went to saw a movie, his first movie, and it blew his mind. I think he only went to one because he couldn't understand what he was experiencing in the movie. Can you imagine just the tobacco? Right? They have those little tobaccos, and they blow it into your nose. Can you imagine that? Yeah, Husserl will still be alive.
Well, someone else? Don't you want to? No. Okay. And, okay, well, we're done here. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your appreciation. By the way, this is the first time I've talked about this publicly. I think it's the perfect place to do it. And I would have never done this if I still was a professor, because I had a lot of enemies in academy, and they would have used this to make me retire.
Thank you. I switch back to Spanish porque los esperamos a las 2 de la tarde, no, a las 3, perdón, a la continuación del taller sobre el libro de Phil que está aquí más en el avance. El avance va a ser el avance.
¿No fue donde ayer?
¿Cómo?
¿No sabes dónde ayer?
Ayer, donde ayer. Sí, ese es el que está rato.
Yeah, okay, good. So we need to talk about what's so still working on that.
Yeah.
So then, when you come to the Steve Kroll session,
Okay. Obviously, yes.
¿Cómo la podamos? Acá. Es que está rara porque nunca se... No, si le